Hello everyone and a warm welcome to this webinar on the topic Introduction to Computer System Validation and Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, Fundamentals and Compliance Insights for Regulatory and Quality Professionals. This webinar is part of a series of planned webinars with the goal of providing information on available career options in the field of vaccinology. My name is Clive Nyaribo, Assistant Research Officer at KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program, providing support to the Vaccine Workforce Development Program. Together with my colleagues, Professor George Warimwe, Miriam Mnena, and Ravenda Nafura, we welcome you to this session. Before we get started, a few housekeeping matters. Kindly note that this webinar is being recorded. Kindly feel free to use the chat option to share your questions during the presentation, and we will address them during the Q&A session. We will also have a few open slots for people to directly ask questions to the presenters. If your internet is stable, you can raise your hand using the available icon. As Arya mentioned, these are a series of planned webinars with the goal of providing information on available career options in the field of vaccinology. This being run under the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program, which is a world-renowned health research unit of excellence based in Kilifi and Nairobi in Kenya, as well as Mbare in Uganda. Over the years, we have excelled in the use of novel ideas and collaborations to achieve better health for Africa, while also developing African scientific leaders. Our mission of the program is to undertake cutting-edge and novel research relevant to national, regional, and global needs. It's under this program that we have the Vaccine Workforce Development Program that aims to expand the technical know-how and capability for sustainable end-to-end vaccine research and development in Africa through training and knowledge exchange activities in the vaccine ecosystem. This involves areas such as target product profiling, research and discovery, preclinical and clinical studies, biomanufacturing, regulatory affairs, and deployment. The workforce development is through 3 channels: internships at vaccine manufacturing institutions that aim at establishing a mentorship scheme that links interns with senior vaccinologists and healthy market systems, and engagement with academics locally to share and strengthen experiences in vaccine research and development and manufacture, and enhance career development. A full-funded master's level course in vaccinology, where applicants are selected based on their direct involvement in vaccine research and their professional excellence and academic achievement. And 3 webinars like this one to area career scientists, graduate and undergraduate university students in Africa to provide information on possible career options for university students for informed career decision making. This program is an arrangement with the African Union's platform for harmonized African health products manufacturing ambition to increase local vaccine production to meet 60% of Africa's routine immunization needs by 2040 and strengthen the capability for vaccine research, discovery, and manufacture in Africa. And this webinar series is part of this engagement. Today, we are glad to have Martin Scotney, who will be discussing the topic Introduction to Computer System Validation and Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, Fundamentals and Compliance Insights for Regulatory and Quality Professionals. Matt joined CEPI in July 2022 as the head of GxP Quality and Compliance, ensuring effective GxP quality support to CEPI and its developers and partners throughout the life cycle of vaccine development and manufacture. He has over 20 years of experience within various quality roles within biopharma and advanced therapies, including validation, batch release, quality support to manufacturing and development, as well as the design, implementation, and improvements of both local and global quality systems to comply with various GxP requirements. Over to you, Matthew.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you for unlocking me so I could access it. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here and to be given the opportunity to present this webinar. As Clive suggested, my name is Matthew Scotney. I have been with CEPI for a little over 3 years now. And if you're not familiar with CEPI, CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And our mission is essentially to rid the world or to prevent future pandemics and epidemics wherever we possibly can, with specific focus on equitable access. And it's a fantastic opportunity that we would like to thank you for being able to give this presentation. To give you some of my background, just so you understand perhaps why I'm able to stand here or sit here as the case may be and present this webinar to you. As was suggested in the introduction, I've had 20 to 25 years worth of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. I've had various different roles, essentially all of them within the quality organization. And I've been fortunate enough to do everything from batch release, so to actually release products, and also through to working with the development functions, quality control functions, validation and engineering. And throughout of that time, I've had the opportunity to work on many computer systems and look at the validation of computer systems. And when I started some 25 years ago, computer systems were very simple and relatively easy in comparison to what we're facing now. I will share my screen. I'm going to turn my camera off just because it's easier and less distracting for myself, but I will turn it on at the end. If you have any questions or anything throughout the presentation, either please put your hand up and I should be able to see it, or type it into the chat and I will do my best to answer those questions. So essentially what we've got today is almost an impossible task. What I'm going to do is try and introduce computer system validation to you alongside good automated manufacturing practice. If you know anything about the pharmaceutical industry, if you've worked in the pharmaceutical industry or you've done any research, what you'll probably realize is that something like an introduction to computer system validation, and in fact, good automated manufacturing practice itself, has huge numbers of courses that are available. Most of those courses run for between 3 and 5 days. So in today's presentation, we're not so much as going to get into detail about these processes. What we're going to talk about is the high level introductions, and it works very well with looking at potential future careers. This is a presentation that was originally given to the NEPAD technical GMP technical committee for upskilling of the regulatory inspectorate across the African Union. So this is the sort of information that if you wanted to perhaps be an inspector, a GMP inspector, you might need to know. But also if you wanted to work within quality, computer system validation is a key part of ensuring that pharmaceutical processes are both developed and completed appropriately. What we're going to look at today is we're going to look at an introduction to computer system validation. We're going to look at, just click down the slides. We're going to look at the foundations of computer systems. We're going to look at good automated manufacturing practice, or otherwise known as GAMP. We're going to try and answer the question, how do you validate a computer system? What might you be looking at? And then if perhaps you were going in to do an assessment of a computer system, the sort of questions that an assessor, an inspector, an auditor might be looking at when they're trying to verify whether a computer system has been successfully implemented. And then finally, we've got some examples of regulatory findings associated with computer system validation, the sort of thing that as an inspector going into an organization might actually be finding. And they're the sort of things that by going through proper computer system validation, by utilizing good automated manufacturing, hopefully we're going to try and avoid those. So the foundations of computer system validation, we obviously have to start somewhere. There is a song in the UK from a musical called The Sound of Music, and it asks the questions, where should we start? And the answer from the song is you should start at the very beginning. So in terms of this introduction, we're actually going to start with the very beginning. The first step is, what are the regulations? What's the guideline associated with computer system validation? As I said, this is very much written for GMP inspectors from the African Union. And one of the things we started looking at is what legislation or guidelines are available within the African Union for the validation of computer systems. The reason we start here is because this is the key part of the process. The regulations and guidance really define what we do and why we do it. And it's critical as a starting point. If you look at the African Union Model Law on medicinal products, it talks about harmonization and adoption of international best practices, which includes the validation of computerized systems. And if we look at some of the new African Medicine Agency documentation, again, they start using and promoting WHO, World Health Organization PICS, which is the Pharmaceutical Inspection Convention, and the European GMP standards for computer systems validation across Africa. It's looking at individual countries. Most individual countries do not seem to have specific legislation for computer system validation themselves, but what they're looking at is compliance with international standards, such as good manufacturing practice, which is needed for the manufacture of medicinal products. GCP is good clinical practice, which is for the execution of clinical trials, or something like good laboratory practice, which is utilized in the testing of new and upcoming medicinal products from the initial phases of the actual development process. What we do have is a number of the national agencies who typically require 4 elements when it comes to computer systems. You've got the validation of GxP related computer systems. You've got evidence of data integrity and security and traceability. You've got documentation of those validation activities, and associated with that, you've got the control of change. So if you're making changes to a computerized system, you need to be looking at how that would be done. And then finally, you've got audit trail and electronic system controls if you're using electronic records, which inevitably you would be when it comes to a computer system. And if we expand that a little bit, where do we get the requirements from? Where are we going to find out exactly what we should or should not be doing? There are a number of different areas. We talked about World Health Organization, we talked about the European Union, both of which have documents associated with the requirements for computer systems. If we look at WHO Annex 5, it says computer systems should be validated to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and ability to discern invalid or altered records. We have a similar thing within Europe, similar thing within the within the American FDA. And then finally, what we look at is we look at what's called the ISP GAMP 5. So ISP is the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineers, and GAMP 5, which we'll discuss in more detail in a little bit, is widely recognized as the industry standard for how you go about conducting validation of a computerized system. So I think if we're talking computerized systems, we need to make sure we're on the same page. And as technology moves on, so computer systems perhaps have become far more complicated. If you look at a word cloud for computer systems, you'll find all sorts of words in there. You can see words like games, things, combinations, memory, but then we get into software, we get into hardware, we get into applications. So what would we think, or what would we define as a computer system? So again, if we come back to some of the guidance documents and some of the regulatory documents, what it talks about is it talks about a computer system consisting of hardware and software components together with all the controlled functions or processes, including people, processes, equipment, and associated documentation. And that definition is a helpful definition, perhaps if you know what all of those words mean and how they all fit together. Likewise, WHO have a very similar definition. But if we try to simplify the definition, and if you ask AI to generate a simple definition of a computerized system, it might come up with something like this. A computer system is a combination of computers and programs that work together to help people do tasks, to store information and make decisions. It includes, and this is probably the most important part of it, it includes not just the computer itself, so not just the black box that we're looking at when we think about a computer, but also the instructions that the computer follows, the equipment that it runs, and the people who use the equipment. So if we looked at it in diagrammatical forms, you've got a computer system being part of the hardware, the software, some of the operating systems, the users, the data, the procedures. And the obvious question is, why is this the definition of a computer system? When we look at computer system validation, when we look from an inspection point of view of how, when you inspect a computer system to make sure it's functioning properly, one of the important things is we need to demonstrate that each individual component is functioning, because only as you look at each individual component can you see the picture as a whole. And if we look at them, you can see here that each component of a computer system can have a significant impact on its ability to function. So from a quality point of view, we would perhaps say, how does it comply with GxP, with GX being the best practice? And in this instance, we're thinking about good manufacturing practice, good clinical practice, good laboratory practice, which we introduced earlier. And you can see here that things like the hardware, the software, data, etc., can have a significant impact on the ability of a computer to function appropriately and produce reliable data. So if we look at hardware, for example, the physical device that makes up the equipment, so the server itself, the workstation, the network equipment, the peripherals, you can imagine, and if you've got any experience of computers, which I'm very sure that you will all have extremely more experience of computer systems than I have, that actually know that if the network cable is not connecting to the computer properly, then you're going to start dropping out. You start losing data. If your Wi-Fi is not robust and you drop in and out of your connectivity, you could be losing a lot of data at that precise moment in time. And obviously data becomes critical, because as soon as we start losing data, the accuracy of the data might be impacted, the completeness of the data, and we'll go on to discuss some of these terms in a little while. The other thing with a computer system is that the user is absolutely critical. So when we talk about compliance, when we talk about appropriate quality within a computer system, it's fantastic having a wonderful computer system. But again, you guys will be familiar with computer systems. You'll be familiar with security. You'll be familiar with the activities on the phone. And we know that you might have some security on your laptop, on your phone. But if you share your password with somebody, anybody can access your system. Anybody can go in and start changing things, which means you don't know who's performed the activity. And one of the things we need from a compliance point of view is we need to make sure that people are, that work is attributable. So the users play a key role also in the computer systems. And as we talked about what a computer system is, so this definition of a computer system, the software, the hardware, etc., is probably somewhat outdated. If you go back to when I started in the industry some 25 years ago, computer systems were very, very simple. They tended to be standalone, and you did your work on the system, and that's where all of the information was kept. Of course, these days, that is not how computer systems work. Computer systems are typically networked. So you have multiple systems coming together. You have software which is available in the cloud environment. You have software which is available on a phone. You have software which can talk to different people across the world at different times. All of this then becomes the system, the computerized system. So instead of just having a computer system, we really have computerized systems. And the computerized system encompasses not only the hardware, the software, the users, etc. It's anything that's connected to that computer, whether it be a labeling machine, whether it be some sort of device for collecting clinical data, whether it is a mobile phone that's connected, whether it's a barcode scanner, whether it's the actual network itself. So it's a much, much bigger definition in terms of what a computer system is. So they're extremely complicated systems, but we still need to be very clear on what constitutes that computer system. So when we look at it from an inspection point of view, we have to understand what is that computer system, how is it made up, how are the components interacting with each other. So if we looked at examples of computer systems within the pharmaceutical industry, what we're looking at is things like distribution control systems or supervisory control and data acquisition systems. So these systems are very much manufacturing systems which allow us to track the operation of activity during the manufacture of a vaccine. We could be looking at something like a laboratory system. So in terms of laboratory systems, you've got perhaps a chromatography data system, which is collecting data when we analyze the product. We could have a laboratory information management system. So the laboratory information system is allowing us to track samples from the moment they enter the lab to the point where the result is provided to whomever the result is provided to. We can also look at the standalone analytical equipment. We talked about things being networked, but even today there are still computers which are independent of anything else, and they might be involved in a specific test. We're also looking at things like Excel spreadsheets, and again, I'm sure you will be very familiar with an Excel spreadsheet. In terms of data quality, data integrity, an Excel spreadsheet has all sorts of calculations, all sorts of capabilities. But again, if you've ever tried to build a macro within Excel or tried to do a formula calculation, if you get that wrong, then you can be getting the wrong results. And if that data is being used to release a product, you can see hopefully how that might have a significant impact on data quality, data validity. We also have quality management systems. So within the pharmaceutical industry, we have the requirement to have a quality management system. So some sort of system that defines how we manufacture the product, how we do training, what happens when things go wrong. And in this particular instance, we move now into quality management systems that are again electronic. So we might have a system that manages all of our documents. So our documents might be our standard operating procedures, our recipes, if you will, to tell us how we do things, our policies and procedures that tell us this is what we're going to do, this is why we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to do it. We might also have things like electronic batch records. An electronic batch record is something where when we're manufacturing the product, you're collecting information, and that could be directly from a computer system. So some sort of instrument that's analyzing the product as it goes through the manufacturing process, or it could be via human input. And if we move further afield, now we're starting to see more and more AI models being used, AI software coming into the industry, which helps us to do faster processing. And again, the consequences of using that AI system should not be overlooked. Predictive analysis, for example, of process optimization, telling us what sort of parameters we think we should be using. Why do we need to trust that data? How can we trust the output from the system that's it's generated? Why does it know that the information it's going to predict is correct? Who's trained that model? How do we actually trust that information? So that's the computer system and some examples of computer systems, but perhaps we also then need to look at what computer system validation is about. So computer system validation is the documented process of ensuring that the computerized system used in the regulated environment is fit for its intended purpose. So when we talk about fit for its intended purpose, we're thinking it gives us consistent results, it performs as expected, and it complies with applicable regulatory requirements. If you're familiar with validation in any way, shape, or form, you'll be familiar with that definition, because the definition of pharmaceutical validation is essentially the same thing, except instead of having computer systems, it just says system validation at the start of it. So why do we validate computer systems? Why is this so important? Ultimately, when we do validation, whether it's of a system or a piece of equipment, or whether it's a computerized system, it essentially does three things. One, it ensures regulatory compliance. There is a regulatory requirement, as we looked at the very start, that says thou shalt validate thy computer systems, or thou shalt validate thy systems. But more importantly than that, it gives us consistent results. It makes sure that the process is repeatable over a period of time. And it also ensures that the data that we're generating is accurate and reliable, which becomes extremely important when you're looking at a product which ultimately is going to go into somebody's arm. How do we know that product is safe? How do we know that product is going to do what it says? That's supported by a whole heap of data. And how do we know that data is appropriate? Because ultimately we've actually done lots of testing and verification that the systems are working properly. So within industry, within pharmaceutical industry, we use what's called ALCOA. It's not new to pharmaceuticals, and it's used in multiple different industries. And this is about data integrity. And what we have is we have it's an acronym that stands for, let me just move through this. What we want is the piece of information, whether it's electronic or on paper, we want it to be attributable. So we want to know who did the action, and then if the result has changed, why it's changed, and who changed it, so we can confirm it's correct. The data needs to be recorded in a legible way. I have worked with many doctors along my years, and doctors are renowned for having very bad handwriting, and they write a prescription and you look at it and you wonder what that prescription says, and it becomes very difficult to actually read the information. Likewise, in a computer system, if we can't have it in human readable form, it becomes very difficult to actually interpret it. We then have a fantastic word called contemporaneous, which ultimately means that the information has been recorded at the time. This is very important because we know that the human memory, even for the best of us, means that you forget things very, very quickly. So if you don't record things within a couple of minutes of it happening, the world can change slightly. What you think happened, what you thought you saw may slightly adjust to the point where you could have been watching a car drive past and you thought in your mind it was a blue car, when in fact, when you've written it down, it was actually, you wrote it down as a blue car, but it was in fact a red car, because for whatever reason, your mind has changed that piece of information. The other thing we're looking at is the originality of the information. So when we capture that first piece of information, that's the original piece of information. Then if it's ever transcribed, we need to know that that transcription process is correct. And that's very important when we talk about computerized systems, because data can move from one system to another system. So how do we know that the information is correct? And then finally, accurate, and that is that all of the information is correct. Nothing, there's been no edits have occurred without some sort of justification. And again, the reason for that is because this information is being used to support potentially the release of a vaccine or the approval of a vaccine. The definitions have been updated to Alcoa++, and essentially what we've just got is a couple more additions to that, all of which essentially are there to make sure that the data that we've collected, whether it's paper data or electronic data, is complete, so all of the information is available. If you're familiar with computer systems, and which I'm sure you are, and you're familiar with files, you'll know that when you save a file, it's not just the file that's saved. There's a whole host of what's called metadata that's saved with it. That will tell you the version of the software. It will tell you the user that was logged on at the time. It will time and date stamp it. So all of that information needs to be available within the record. We need to have consistency such that it does the same thing over and over again. So if we save the record 6 times, the same information is being recorded in the same way. The other thing that's really important from a computer system point of view is that the information is available. Many of the records that we generate from a computer system point of view should be kept for upwards of 25 years. If you have been involved with computer systems for any length of time, and I'm sure even those people who are currently working at university thinking of your phones, the changes in technology have been significant over the last 10 years. The changes over the last 25 years have been absolutely staggering. And what it means is data that we generated 25 years ago is now in a format that actually is not possible to read. We don't have the technology currently that's available to read some of the original disks where data was actually saved. And from a pharmaceutical point of view, we need to have that data, and it needs to be both enduring and available. So we've talked about computer system validation. We've talked about why it's important. The different, bringing it back to what Clive was saying about in terms of what roles could one do within the computer system validation world. You could actually be a person who's doing the assessment of the pharmaceuticals themselves. You could be somebody who's assessing the computer system. So you could be a computer system validation expert, and you could be looking at each system and working out how to test it and what to do. And if you're going to go into computer system validation, Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, or GAMP, is a very important document. It was written by the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineers in approximately 1995. So you can see it's been around for a while, but it was basically put in place because of the complexity of computerized systems and how these computerized systems were rapidly changing. And ultimately, the guide provides a standard risk-based and very practical approach for validating and managing computer systems in regulated environments. So this is relevant to the review and approval, for the manufacture of vaccines, but it's also relevant in other parts of industry and in the world as well, to make sure that the computer system is functioning appropriately. One of the key things with GAMP is it's recognized globally by many of the regulatory authorities. What I would say is if you're interested in computer system validation, and this presentation sparks your imagination, and this is something you might want to be looking at more, GAMP is a significant amount of money. It is not a cheap document in any way, shape or form. However, it is worth trying to spend some more time looking at good automated manufacturing practice. And if you can acquire the document, fantastic. If you can't acquire the document, there are many training presentations, including free training presentations available on the internet, which you could spend more time going into what GAMP is all about. If we wanted to sort of summarize GAMP, so it's about a 250-page document, but if you wanted to summarize it in just a few slides or in a few words, we'd probably come up with 6 key items. The first one is around product and process knowledge. So in order to validate a computerized system, we need to make sure that they've been designed appropriately and we understand what it's actually being used for. So whatever that computerized system is being used to support, that we know that very clearly what the purpose is. What are we trying to do? What's the intent? And once we've done that, we can then look at things like what's called specifications and verification. And in its simplest form, the specifications are telling us what the system is supposed to do, and then verification is telling us, does it actually achieve what we want it to do? One of the other things that's a key part of computers and good automated manufacturing practice is engagement with suppliers. So one of the other areas that you can potentially work in is carrying out assessments or audits or inspections of suppliers of computerized systems. In today's world where computer systems are very complicated, they're typically owned by a third party. So if you as a manufacturer or you as either as a third party of somebody buying in a computer system or as an assessor, what we want to know is how is the supplier of this software controlling it? Are they controlling it appropriately? Do they have the relevant expertise? Are they meeting the regulatory requirements? Because although they might not be directly working in the pharmaceutical industry, their product is being used by a manufacturer of the pharmaceutical product, and therefore they have to follow certain legislations, etc. The other thing that GAMP actually brings in is the scalability. And if you work in pharmaceuticals for any length of time, whether it be in the clinical arena, whether it be in the manufacturing arena, the term quality risk management will be a significant part of your toolkit, if you will. And GAMP is no different. So it talks about a risk-based approach. And essentially, a risk-based approach is saying, okay, we need to understand the complexity of the system, we need to understand what it's being used for, and we need to understand the impact it could potentially have on patient safety, data integrity, and product quality. And the more significant the impact would be, then the more significant the level of time, effort, and energy we need to put into making sure it works properly. And that's coupled with what's called science-based quality risk management. And this concept is making sure there is a sound scientific justification for the approach that's being taken. So if you decided, or if an organization decided they weren't going to do computer system validation, they were just going to use the system as it was, the question we might be asking from an inspection point of view or from an audit point of view is, well, what's the justification? Please explain to me why you don't need to do anything. And we would expect that to be a very robust justification that could be challenged. If you're interested in quality risk management, at the back of this presentation, which I will supply and hopefully will be able to send out, is some more detail on how one might do quality risk management from a computer validation point of view. There are many, many tools out there, and we'll talk about them in a bit, but just to add that in there while I remember it. The final part of GAMP is computer systems now need to be looking at a life cycle approach. So historically, one might do the validation of a computer system and then say, yes, it's validated. And then it would be left to operations to actually use the computer system. Now, essentially, what we need to be looking at from the very start. So the concept of the computer system or the concept of the software right through to the point where we stop using that software or it's decommissioned. And if we had to sort of create a little model as to what this might look like, you've got the concept where you write the requirements, the specifications. So that might be defining the business need and what the justification is for actually having the system in place. We might be setting the scope of the system. How big is this system going to be? What's going to be covered? What's included? What's external? What's excluded? We might identify the actual requirements themselves. in terms of the initial requirements. So what is the key thing I need it to be doing? I need it to be able to process video. I need it to be able to deal with 150 documents at the same time. I need it to be able to hold 3,000 gigabytes of data. So you start putting that together. Once you've got that piece of information in place, you then might start a project in order to actually to purchase and qualify or validate this particular computer system. And in this instance, what we're looking at is we're doing some sort of risk assessment, assessing what the impact of this particular software, this computer system might be in terms of product quality, data integrity. We're starting to look at the evaluation of the supplier and how we're actually going to do the qualification. So what documentation do we need? What evidence can we provide to a regulatory authority that we've done this, this testing appropriately? We're going to start then writing some formal specifications and actually configuration of the system. So we're going to take our user requirement statement and we're going to create some more detail behind a user requirement statement. That might be what's called a functional specification. So a little bit more detail as to, in a simplest idea, you might say, okay, I want my computer, I'm looking at my computer in front of me and the case is black. So my requirements might be, I want the computer to be black. And then the more detailed specifications might be, actually, I want it to be made of plastic or instead of metal, because that might be a specific reason. It might be that you then need to say what size is the box that a computer is actually going to be in. So it's that sort of level of detail down. We're also going to start looking at some of the configuration and how we're going to build the system. And finally, what sort of testing are we going to do in order to demonstrate that this system is working properly? We then release it to operations. So this is giving it to the guys who are going to be using the system. And at this point, we're looking at the control of the system and how you're going to manage change. Again, you'll be familiar with computer systems. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with Word and Microsoft. And you see the number of times that the computer system's updated. You go to shut down and your computer system says, I'm running an update. What's the impact of the update? How could that update impact on your system? Will it impact on your security, etc.? So within this phase, we're looking at having standard operating procedures, which tell us exactly how we're going to use them. We're looking at the training of operators. We're looking at maintaining the system security. So you can start perhaps seeing here in terms of, again, roles that are available within the pharmaceutical industry. You could come into the pharmaceutical industry with an IT background, and that IT background is critical to understand the computer systems and be able to explain to people what exactly is being done. As an IT professional, you can look at perhaps how one might do that testing. You could start looking at how you maintain the security of the system over time. So there's potentially another role in terms of computer system validation that one could be involved in. The final part of any system is the retirement, and ultimately here we're looking at what are we going to do with that data. We talked about needing to keep the data for upwards of 25 years in some instances. So how are we going to store that data? Are we going to move it from one system to another? At the end of its life cycle, are we going to destroy the data or are we going to put it somewhere different? And how exactly are we going to achieve all of this oversight? The other thing that GAMP introduces, which is very relevant if you're doing an assessment of a computer system, is a level of categorization. So we talked about this risk-based approach to computer system validation, and this is probably the start of it here. So we're looking at different sorts and different types of computerized system. Initially, excuse me, there were 5, but it's now been reduced down to 4. Because one of the categories is no longer relevant. It was one of the initial systems which when GAMP first came out was appropriate, but as we have developed computer systems, so the use of firmware is not relevant anymore. So we have sort of basic infrastructure, things like the operating systems, potentially middleware, network software. These don't directly impact on the GxP operation, but they're important in order to keep the computer running. And then we have standard software, which perhaps you buy off the shelf with minimal configuration. We then have software that you can configure. The the difference, if you will, between configuration and customization is very important. If you think of a Lego set, hopefully you guys are familiar with Lego. So the Lego sets, you've got different sorts of bricks, and those bricks come together to form a model, whatever that model may be. So your configuration is each individual block is coming together. You're not creating the individual blocks. What you're doing is taking those blocks and putting them together to build a piece of software. So that would be configuration. Customization is you're actually creating the individual blocks. So it's not just about putting the blocks together, it's about building the individual blocks. And that's important because obviously the two are slightly different in terms of complexity. One of them, you can have predetermined blocks, so you can do a lot of testing associated with those. The other is a brand new block that nobody's ever built it before. And again, if we're looking at roles within the pharmaceutical industry, the ability to build computer software that is suitable for the pharmaceutical industry is obviously very important. So that would potentially be another role where perhaps an IT professional could work. So how do you validate a computer system? We've talked about computer systems. We've talked about GAMP. How would you go about actually validating a computer system? We talked about the initial stage, which is around the planning and the risk assessment. So this is where we need professionals from the operations team. Those people are actually going to use the software. We need the IT team because they're the people who are going to be asking the questions, discussing it potentially with suppliers as well. We need to involve people potentially from the regulatory team to understand the regulations, and we potentially would need quality in there as well to look at how we're going to confirm that this product is going to meet our requirements. And what we're probably going to do is we're going to do some sort of risk assessment, and that risk assessment will say, okay, what's the potential impact of this system? And based on the risk, we're then going to start looking at what sort of functions need to be tested. We're going to start looking at what level of documentation might be needed in order to support the process. And as we do that, we're going to move to the second phase, which is around the specifications. So this team is going to start writing the specifications, and there are a number of different types of specifications that you would put depending on the level of complexity of the system. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to document what the system is supposed to do, and that's really important because that specification is then used in the next phase, which is the configuration and coding. So this is where an organization typically would go away and they would build this system for us. Once the system is built, our next phase is around the testing and qualification. So somebody's built the system, so we're then going to test that system. We're going to confirm that the system meets all of our requirements, and we're going to document that information. And that documentation is really important because that's what we would give to an inspector, to a regulatory authority, potentially our quality team, to say this system has been built and it does exactly what we want it to do. We then we then release the system. So we're going to generate a series of documents here, which essentially say that this system is now fit for purpose and we can hand it over to the operations team. If you're familiar with validation in the pharmaceutical industry, then you'll be familiar with what's called the V model. Essentially what you've got is down the left-hand side, you've got all the specifications that we were talking about. So this is where we find out what the system is supposed to do. At the bottom of the V model, you've got the build of the system. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the actual testing to demonstrate how the system has been built appropriately. And this model is used not only for computer system validation, it's used for all validations of equipment, processes, etc. So this is a very common model that's used for validation. The difference here is, as we talked about, you can see that some of it's done by the customer, so the person who's requesting the software. Some of it is done by the supplier because of the very nature of computer systems, because of the complexities, etc. We're now starting to work a lot more with suppliers in demonstrating or in building the system. So we would give this information to a supplier. So actually that interaction between the customer and the supplier becomes very, very critical. So if we were to look at the different levels of validation that might be required, the idea here is that from an expertise point of view, if you've got a low-level system, so GAMP category 3, so if you remember there were originally 5 categories, category 1 being the operating system, so we don't necessarily need to do very much with that. Category 2 doesn't exist, so category 3 is probably a relatively simple system. In this instance, it's not configurable in any way, shape or form. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, what do we want? What do we actually need it to do? We're then going to look at a supplier and make sure the supplier can actually deliver against that. We're then going to record this information within some sort of computer system directory. And the reason we do that is because that's our index of all the computer systems that we use. And that index is really important because that's what demonstrates when we've done our system level risk assessment. So that index tells us whether it's a complex system or a simple system. It tells us the risk from a patient safety, product quality point of view. It also starts looking at perhaps who the vendor was, who the system owner is. And all of this information is very, very important when we start asking questions of the system. So if you're inspecting a computer system, this computer system listing is probably one of your starting points that says, okay, Matt Scotney is the owner of this system. I'd like to speak to him about it. So you can bring the relevant person in and you can start asking them, how have they qualified it? Why is it a critical system? Why did they think validation wasn't required? What we might do is conduct some really basic testing here. A very, very good example, perhaps, of non-configurable software is software associated with a pH probe. Hopefully, you'll be familiar with electronic pH probes. So you've got a probe and it's attached to a little system. You test the pH and it obviously gives you a reading. That reading is then typically printed out, although you could store it electronically. So there's very little you can actually do. The pH probe is calibrated, so you can replace the probes, etc. But ultimately, you can't really play with the software. It does, you ask it to do something, and it basically does exactly what it's asked to do. So a really, really simple system at that point. If we look at a slightly more complicated system, something like a configured system here, and again, if we come back to that level of the Lego example, if you've bought a Lego set, for example, and it comes in different pieces, you've got your instructions, which the vendor has provided with you. You've got your individual Lego components. They've built each one of those individual Lego components. So again, we've still got some sort of risk assessment. We want to be looking at what this product or what this computer system is doing. How does it impact on product quality? How does it impact on data integrity? And then we're going to assess the supplier based on that complexity. So if it's a really important system, if it's used for critical data, we're potentially going to go in and we're going to do an audit of the supplier. We're going to look at how they built their computer systems. We're going to look at how they control their software versions, how they do version updates. If there's bug fixes, how do they do bug fixes, etc. And we're also potentially going to look at some of their documentation as well. So if they've helped us to write the documentation and they've told us what the specification might be, we would want to look at it. So again, if we use the Lego model, the Lego model comes with instructions. How do you know those instructions are correct? How have they kept version control of those instructions? We're then going to start doing some testing. We've still got the computer system listing. Again, we would record the information on the computer system listing because that's important. The other thing the computer system listing allows us to do is look at how frequently we need to go back and check the system is still appropriately assessed and the qualification is still appropriate. We then do some basic testing, or we perhaps do some more in-depth testing at this precise moment in time. So if we want the system to do specific activities, we would test those specific activities because that's critical for us. The other thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at how do we maintain the software control? How do we manage that software, especially if that software is being provided by somebody else? So if there is a change to the software, how do we find out about it? Can we control it? Can we turn it on and off, or is it automatic? And what happens if the system is updated? Do we as an organization get to say yes or no, or is it just automatically updated? Because if it's automatically updated, that could impact on what we want it to be doing. So if suddenly the organization who owns the software decides to turn off a specific element, that element might be really important for our product quality. So we would need to know that piece of information. If you look at the final category, that customization bit, that's where not only do we have a Lego block itself, but we're actually building the individual block. We're making unique Lego blocks, which are then being used to build the computer system. In this instance, we're talking about some serious level of computer system verification. And frankly, for me at this point in time, coming from a biology, sort of microbiology, biotechnology background into quality and into the validation world, even with lots of experience, this is still something that I'm looking at going, do you know what, I need a proper IT professional here to help me. I would need to understand what the IT professional is looking at. I could ask lots of questions, but I wouldn't necessarily know whether the system is being built appropriately. So when we get into the customized software, we're really looking at some significant expertise in computer systems. And again, we call on our IT professionals systems to support us at this point in time. And the critical factor there is you've got quality and you've got IT. And actually, we talk different languages. So what we need to do is then be able to translate it. So the ideal person is somebody who's from an IT background, who understands pharmaceuticals to a degree and is able to have those conversations. So that's another really important skill. It's being able to translate the information into a different technical platform and to be able to have those discussions, because obviously we need those discussions to make sure that we're generating what we want at the end of the day. The other thing in terms of the validation, it doesn't stop there. So we talked about once it was implemented, you need to look at the ongoing control of that document. And what you've got on the right-hand side here is some of the SOPs, some of the procedures that you might need, some of the systems that you might need to have in place. Things like security administration, things like change management, which we talked about. When things go wrong, which inevitably they do, we need to start looking at how are we going to manage that? How do we know what's happened? The other thing, which becomes more and more important, is this business continuity. And as we see more cyber attacks, as we use technology more and more, as we become more dependent on technology, what happens if there's a cyber attack on the organization? That cyber attack could be quite significant. I'm based in the UK, and currently the Land Rover business in the UK was hit by a cyber attack. And that cyber attack appears to have taken the manufacturing facility out of action for in the region of a month so far, and they still haven't quite solved it. So that business continuity element becomes absolutely critical when we're talking about computerized systems. If you're looking at a cloud system and that system is no longer available, what are we going to do about it? So now we're starting to look at specialized people looking at data integrity, data security, business continuity, making sure that the business can carry on, making sure that we can carry on manufacturing the vaccines in the event that something goes wrong. Because obviously if we're not able to manufacture the vaccines, if we're not able to test or release, then we can't get the vaccines into patients' arms, which becomes a serious problem. The next part of it then is around the periodic review and the retirement of the system. So really the final part of this validation life cycle is things are not changing, things move on. So people move from organization to organization. The criticality of a system may change, the importance of a system may change. So what we need to be doing is regularly going back and looking at what we did. Is it still relevant? Do we need to do any further validation based on information that we now know that we didn't know before? A good example might well be the cybersecurity element. So some of our systems might have been built 4 or 5 years ago where perhaps cybersecurity was less significant. Well, actually, is our security acceptable? Are our protocols sufficient that it would prevent a cyber attack? Or would our backup processes allow us to revert in the event that we did have some sort of security incident? The other thing, and we talked about this briefly, is that planning and execution of the system retirement. It's no good just thinking, well, at some point we're going to stop using this system. We need to know what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So even as we build the system, we probably need to be thinking about, well, what happens in 20 years' time when the system's not being used? What's going to happen with the data? If we're working with a vendor and they own the cloud, how is the data going to be accessible? So we would still need to be able to demonstrate that that data is robust, and that data is still needed to support potentially a vaccine in 20 years' time. But if it's not owned by you as an organization, what are we going to do? How do we make sure that we can still access that data? So spent a length of time looking at computer systems and computer system validation. We've looked at good automated manufacturing practice. Both of those are very much a sort of starting point, if you will. So if you're interested in good automated manufacturing practice, if you're interested in computer system validation as a career, it's great things to be able to go out there. Obviously, one needs to be a little careful on the internet with the information that you're reading to make sure it's from a reputable source. But there are some very good organizations who've got very good documentation. And again, in the back of the presentation, there is a backup slide. There's a couple of organizations who I've highlighted where I've used their information for before. One of those is called QBD, and there's a document called QBD, a complete guide to computer system validation. And that is an excellent starting point that you could, if you're interested in computer system validation, you could start there. That's a free document, unlike good automated manufacturing practice, which is obviously quite expensive in that particular instance. So that's the sort of the computer system element. One of the things when this presentation was written is, as we were suggesting, we were working with inspectorates, and one of the other critical roles within the pharmaceutical industry is the quality role or the inspection role, the auditing role or the assessor role. And it can be very, very daunting if you're looking at a computer system saying, well, okay, as an auditor, as an assessor, as a inspector, I need to be able to demonstrate and I need to be able to satisfy myself that this computer system, whatever it's being used for, is fit for purpose and does exactly what we want it to do. And the next section of the presentation really is just some ideas about where one could start if you're doing an assessment. So the first step is probably looking at the actual policy document. So does the organization have a policy on computer system validation? It could be called any number of things, but ultimately, how do they do computer system validation? Does it look at the life cycle of the computer system? We've talked about how important it is sort of cradle to grave. So what does the policy have to say on this? One of the other things we've talked about is the interaction of multiple different types of professionals here. So from IT to quality to the supplier to the operations team. So how does the policy define the roles and responsibilities? Because if the policy doesn't define who's responsible for something, how do we know it's going to be being completed appropriately? The other thing then is, how does the policy align to other documents? So within the pharmaceutical industry, we talk an awful lot about data integrity, making sure that the data is it's appropriate, it's not being changed. And again, we go back to those Alcoa principles. We look at vendor qualification. We talked about a supplier being a key part of the computer systems. So how do we know that the vendor's been appropriately qualified? We've discussed this term quality risk management. So typically organizations within the pharma industry have a quality risk management policy and procedure. How does computer system validation link with quality risk management? Are they joined? Do they interact with each other, or are they completely separate? Similarly, with change control, business continuity and documentation, what we're looking for here is we're looking for a policy that really well defines how you do computer systems and validation and how it fits with the rest of your documentation. The other thing we talked about is this computer system listing. Again, it can be called many, many different things, but the obvious questions are, does it contain everything? Does it include spreadsheets, perhaps, that are used in QC? Does it include AI tools? And when was it last updated? Is it a document that's a living document and people are going in and adding systems to? Because we know that systems are always being added. There is always new technology that's being used. There's always new technology that's being delivered. So this documentation really needs to consider all of that technology. Does that listing contain a description and the information, things like who the vendor is, where is it hosted? Is it an on-premise solution? Is it a software as a service solution? Is it a cloud-based solution? Who's the system owner? Because this information is really important. We talked earlier about the system owner would be the person who would probably have to go in front of an inspector and start discussing the system and being able to say, yes, it was validated. Yes, we know it's fit for purpose because of X, Y, and Z. You can look at things like, how have the systems all been classified? We talked about a risk-based approach, so not all systems are equal. If every system is classified as high risk, that tells you something. Equally, if everything is classified as low risk, again, it tells you a similar sort of thing. Again, when were the systems validated? If the system was validated 5 years ago, have we done some sort of periodic review? Have we done something to confirm that the system is still relevant? We then have this system level risk assessment. So this is a document below the listing, and this is basically looking at every single individual element of the computer system to say, okay, what level of criticality is it? And we're looking for quite a detailed document here that talks about what's critical, what's non-critical. It tells you how the system works, how the system interacts with different parts of the process. We're looking for a document here that has the robust justification for the system classification. So if the computer system listing has one line, here we're looking for a much more detailed justification. We're looking for the use of recognized risk assessment processes. From a pharmaceutical point of view, the risk management process brings multiple tools alongside it. Severity, detectability, and likelihood of occurrence is one of these tools that you can utilize. And again, in the back of the presentation, in the in the backup information, there's a risk management process that you could be utilizing for computer system validation. There isn't time to talk about it in detail here, but what this looks at is it's the process that says, well, okay, how do we understand each element of the computer system, each function of the computer system? So this risk assessment becomes a very, very detailed document, and it ultimately allows us to really confirm what the risks are with using the computer system, and then what we can do to either reduce those risks or to demonstrate that we have a process in place that's going to control those risks. And if we can't, what activities do we need? What additional processes might we need to actually generate secure data, etc. Within the assessment process, we're also going to start looking at the validation documentation. And again, one of the things that auditors and inspectors do is spend an awful lot of time looking at documentation. So we're trying to understand what's been done, why it's been done. We're trying to look at how an organization is proving that this system's working properly. We've got this concept of a traceability matrix, which is wonderful language. And all it means is, well, you've said you wanted to do one thing. Where in your testing does it demonstrate that that requirement has been met? We're also looking at things like the acceptance criteria as well. So when you do testing, what you want to do is you know what the answer you're looking for is. It's no good doing a test without knowing what the answer is. So as part of the creation of the validation, we're going to sort of ask a question and we know what the answer should be. And the reason we're doing that is because we need to verify that it's actually delivered what we expected. If it doesn't do what we expect, then we might have what's called a deviation or an event or an investigation that then says, what's the consequence of that? And that's where we head into the specifications and the testing. And again, we're looking at these documentations in a lot more detail. And the one I was just talking about there is when you execute a test, inevitably things go wrong. Whenever you do project work, something will happen. The question is, well, what did you do about it and how did you fix it? And that's where we've got this bottom line here, deviations, and CAPA is a fancy word for corrective and preventative action. So there, what we're looking at is, okay, something went wrong. How have you corrected it? And from a quality point of view, we would be signing off to say, yes, we think that's acceptable. From a technical point of view, you're saying, yes, this was done appropriately. And from the inspector point of view, you're going to be looking at it going, did that really deal with the issue? The other thing that we're starting to look at when we do assessment of computer systems is we're looking at how people have been trained. We talked about people being absolutely important to these processes, and computer systems are no longer just about the hardware or the software. What training have we done for our operators? And when we talk about the operators, we're thinking about those people who use the system. So that could be a person who's literally manufacturing a batch of vaccine. So it's somebody who's on what I would describe as the shop floor. They're there with a process directly in front of them. They're manufacturing some part of that vaccine. We could be looking at the IT professional who's doing a review of the security, and they make sure that the security systems are up to date. We could be looking at the quality professional. We could be looking at an auditor. So there's many, many people who we're looking at. Are they trained? We want to document the training. Within the pharmaceutical industry, there's an old adage that says if it's not documented, it wasn't done. So fair enough. What we want to do is we want to be making sure these things have been documented and that the roles and responsibilities are clear. But come back to the why. Why do we need trained people? When we talked about what was critical about computer systems, we talked about this concept about the person. Well, we want to know that who's done the activity. We want to know how they've done the activity. We want to know when they've done the activity. If the login details are written under the keyboard, anybody can log in, anybody could change anything, anybody could then have an impact on the product quality, data integrity. So you can see why personnel become quite important. And then we have system functionality and controls. So each system operates in a specific way, but how do we know that person A and person B and person C are doing the same operation over and over again? And that's where the system functionality comes in. How do we know it's being maintained properly? How do we know data is being dealt with in the correct way? And then finally, we've got things like the change control process. We talked about the computer systems and the fact they evolve over time. It is really critical that that evolution, if you will, is managed appropriately. If the owner of the software makes a change and that change directly impacts on the use of the system and how it's maintaining data, then we could have a significant impact on data integrity, which could lead to issues with patient safety. And a really simple process here is within the pharmaceutical industry, people are typically split up into different areas. So if you work in quality, for example, your permissions will be very different than if you work as an operator. So as an operator, you might be able to enter data within a computer system. From a quality point of view, you might be able to review that data and then approve that data. But can you imagine if one of those people changed place, if the quality person moved from quality into operations? Now they have the ability not only to enter data, but if their processes, if their login hasn't been changed, they also have the ability to approve data. Now, that's not suggesting they're going to do that, but they could accidentally do something. So how we manage those control processes is really important. We talked about backup and recovery, and I gave you the incident of what's going on at Jaguar Land Rover in the UK. Obviously, it's absolutely critical in this day and age, especially with the computer system. How do we make sure that the information is going to be available in the future? We talked about vendor and supplier management, and again, this is a key part of what we're doing. We're interacting with vendors. We're doing these these assessments. What we also want to do is we want to make sure that the vendor is delivering to a certain level of quality. So what we would need is things like quality agreements in place or service level agreements. So this is essentially a document that defines what our minimum expectations are. And then data integrity, data security. One of the classics that you often see when you do an assessment of a computer system is you see an administrator who can go in and add or change users. Perhaps they can add or change data. So the administrator is also a user, which means in theory they could execute a test, then go in as the administrator and change all the details. So if they made a mistake, they could potentially cover it up. So that's the sort of things we want to be looking at and making sure are being reviewed and making sure that processes are acceptable and not allowing this, whether it's intentional or unintentional breaches of data integrity. So a real whistle-stop tour. We're coming up to an hour, and what I wanted to do was give some time for questions and to really throw the floor open, which I hope Clive will be okay. But before we do that, what about the consequences? So we talked about computer system validation, we talked about GAMP and what it's all about. So if you come into the pharmaceutical industry, the whole point is that we're manufacturing some sort of pharmaceutical product. We're doing research into the product. From a CEPI point of view, we work primarily with vaccines. So we want to get vaccines to the market. We want to be saving lives, and vaccines are very important, obviously, so medicinal products are equally as important. So what we have is we have the regulators, and the regulators are looking at all the systems that we work with to confirm that what we're doing is what we say we're doing, that the vaccines, that the medicinal products are safe, they're efficacious, etc. And if you look at computer systems validation, and you can do a search on the internet for findings associated with computer systems, it's amazing the sort of things that you're going to come up with. So the classic one is really starting at the beginning. An inspector observed a company failed to validate a computer system involved in a GxP process. So essentially what they've got is they've got a computer system which is involved in some way, shape or form with a process that needs to be validated. And the organization is unable to demonstrate that that system is appropriate. They're unable to prove that the system does exactly what it says it's intended to do. So you end up with a regulatory finding, which is essentially this: the system is not reliable and data integrity could not be guaranteed. Obviously, the expectations is that the systems are validated in accordance with, and I've used, this is an FDA observation, so this one comes from 21 CFR Part 11, but it would also be relevant to EU Annex 11 and some of the WHO documents and African Union documents. The other one is another really interesting one and very easy to do as well. You've got a validation policy, and the validation policy says thou shalt validate one's computer systems. You've got SOPs that say this is how we do it, and the organization has those in place, but they weren't followed it. So for whatever reason, they didn't follow those documentations. And what you can see here is we talked about that life cycle model. We talked about the fact that we have a project which defines what we're going to do. We're going to execute that. We're going to do the testing, and then we release the product. And in this instance, what's happened is a deviation is an event that's occurred during the qualification, which means that it has failed in some way, shape or form. So the software didn't do what we expected it to do. So when we did the test, we expected a result and we got a different result. And what happened in this instance was the organization didn't record the deviation. They didn't do an assessment of the deviation, but they still went ahead and released the system for use, which of course brings into question the validity of what's happened. And even if it's a minor issue, you still need to have some sort of documented procedure that says, okay, they've said you must do this, this is what you must do in order to release it, and then obviously they haven't followed those processes. Within computer systems, you have, certainly within pharmaceutical industry, there's the requirement to have an audit trail. So for want of a better way of describing it, the audit trail is going to log every critical activity that occurs within that software. So essentially, if we go back to those Alcoa principles, the audit trail will tell you who did it, when they did it, how they did it, what they entered. If data was changed, it'll tell you how it was changed, who did the change, etc., etc. And in this particular instance, we have an audit trail, which is fantastic, but users can go in and alter or remove entries in the audit trail. The fundamental issue with that, of course, is if somebody can change the audit trail, then that audit trail could have been entirely fabricated. So that result that says this product was in specification when we did the test could be that they never did the test. It could be that a test failed and somebody changed it and they put it into specification. Or it could be that it's perfectly acceptable and nobody changed it. Because you can change the audit trail, of course, you couldn't determine that in any way, shape or form. The other problem with audit trails is if you're ever involved in an audit trail review, they typically run to thousands and thousands of pages, because if you imagine, some audit trails capture every single keystroke. So every time you press the letter T, the letter H, it records what's happened. That's a huge amount of data. But they're there for a reason. So we need to understand what data we're collecting, and we need to be able to review that data to define what the issues are. So the question is, why are we recording that information? And if we're recording it, how often do we check it and to make sure it's consistent? And in this instance, the organization didn't consistently review the audit trails as part of their quality control procedures. So nobody's confirming that the processes are not being tampered with and that mistakes are not, that something's not having mistakes that are being missed. Then we start looking at data integrity. And in this instance, the NRA has identified that the data within the computer system was neither secure nor properly backed up. So we're back to that question of, if we've got to keep this data, we need it to be secure, so we can't change it. Or if it is changed, we need to understand why. And we also need to back it up to make sure that if something goes wrong, we can still access the data. And obviously, in this instance, the absence of that means you've got unauthorized access potentially and data that might be lost. The next one down is, again, because of the complexity of computer systems, it's looking at the vendor evaluation and management. So we talked about that being such a really important part of today's computer systems. We have to work with the vendors that we're buying the computer systems from, but then equally we have to be able to go through and do thorough vendor assessments to confirm that those vendors are going to be capable of meeting our requirements. And in this particular instance, the NRA, National Regulatory Authority, discovered that the company didn't thoroughly evaluate the third party. So in other words, there's bringing into question their ability to support the pharmaceutical industry. So a rapid whistle-stop tour into computers and into computer system validation. Ultimately, computer system validation is there to verify that computer systems, in this instance within the GMP world, but it could be within that GxP world, so the much wider framework, are consistently performing as intended and to ensure product quality, patient safety and data integrity are maintained. We've also discussed GAMP and the requirements that are detailed within good automated manufacturing practice. So this concept that validation activities have to be scalable based on risk. So with more critical systems having more time being spent on the more stricter validation requirements. We've also looked at the fact that we need to look at some sort of life cycle management from a computer system. So from that cradle, the initial concept right through to the grave, when actually we're going to retire the system. And the two areas which are critical to computer system validation is maintaining that data integrity. That's the whole point. We want to protect against loss. We want to protect against unauthorized changes. And that's where our audit trail and electronic signatures might come in. And then finally, it's that concept that validation is not a one-stop shop. When I started in the pharmaceutical industry several hundred years ago, validation tended to be done and then was forgotten about. And actually, as we've evolved, so validation becomes critical all of the time. We need to be continuously looking at what's required, making those reassessments, making sure that our initial assessments are appropriate. If we suddenly change the use of the system, the risks associated with the system might change. And therefore, we need to have continuous evolution into computer system validation. So that's a real whistle-stop tour into the sort of introduction to computer system validation and good automated manufacturing practice. As we've gone through, try to look at potentially the roles that you could be taking within the pharmaceutical industry, sort of linked in with computer systems. And again, as indicated, there are, this is the starting point. If computer system validation interests you, this is very much the starting point. I hope it sort of opened your eyes to the capabilities and possibilities that are out there if you like working with computerized systems, or if you like doing assessments of data. What you'll find in the backup slides, and again, I will share these and hopefully they can be shared wider, is the references. We talked a little bit about where to start in terms of documentation, and I would highly recommend the Complete Guide to Computer System Validation by QBD. It's a free resource. I suspect you probably have to put your email information in there, and you'll probably end up with some emails from them, but I would highly recommend looking at something like those ones. Likewise, the Skylife Handbook on Computer System Validation according to GAMP5. They're two very, very good resources. I've used them as part of the talk. The legislation, so WHO, PICS, and the good practice and the draft guidance, again, are very helpful, but I think they're perhaps designed for more people who are actually involved in the pharmaceutical industry. So if you're heavily embedded in the pharmaceutical industry and you want to know more, there's a good place to start. Ultimately, ISPE is the way to go if you're going to be working in validation and computer system validation. Again, I would look with the organization you're working with to acquire the GAMP5 version 2, and even the new guide, which again is extremely good, GAMP, on how you validate AI systems. The other parts of the system, this is risk assessment, so I'm not going to go into that, but all of that information is there in the background. And with that, I shall turn my camera back on and just ask, has anybody got any questions, anything I can help with? Hopefully that has given you a good insight into computer system validation in the pharma industry and how you could work in it.
Thank you, Matthew. This has been a very insightful talk. We'll go direct to the Q&A session. Hopefully, you have some questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. You can use the chat to type your question, or the Q&A session, or you can raise your hand for question. Yes, as we wait for the audience to ask a question, the computer system validation is majorly embedded in equipment qualification. What's your take? Can we treat it separately, or still we can have it in the protocols for equipment qualification?
It depends on the level of complexity of the computer system and the associated piece of equipment. So for a relatively simple piece of equipment, I'll just go with a pH probe because it's relatively simple, conductivity probe, etc. If they're standalone pieces of equipment, you can probably include it in the same document. If you're starting to look at something which is perhaps more complicated, like a manufacturing execution system, you're going to need to qualify your equipment, you're going to need to qualify your system, and as part of that, you then need to qualify how the two are linked together. So as part of the equipment validation, you need to confirm that the connection to the computer system is working and vice versa.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Yes.
And then just to clarify for anybody who's thinking about asking a question but thinking it might be a daft question, there really is no such thing as a daft question. If you want to work in quality, one of the roles I see as quality is asking those questions. Really important, because we're asking questions of technical people. So if that person is not going to be able to answer it, then that tells us a lot. So if you have a question, please do ask it. I'm very happy to answer them.
Sure.
The other possibility is if people don't want to ask questions, I'm very happy to answer the questions electronically if people would prefer to sort of message me afterwards. I'm happy with that, as long as that's acceptable to KEMRI.
Yeah, it is very much acceptable. There is one question from Nitin Fasan. How could you test the recovery process of a computer system, especially on a live system?
That is a remarkably good question. So what I would be looking at is at some point, if there's been some sort of interruption in the system and you've had to restore it, what you would need to know is the point at which the system was interrupted. So you would need to know what the data was beforehand. You would then have your point where it's the system is broken. So what I would be looking at is before the system goes live again is I would recover all of the data. I would look at the period of time that was lost, and I would make sure that all of the entries are the same. So you wouldn't necessarily verify every single entry. What you might do is you might do a 10% check of the entries to confirm that the entries are acceptable. If they're all identical, you might then move on. If there's problems, you might then do more checks, etc. You can also do things like checksum. So often when we migrate system information, what we'll do is we'll do electronic checks to confirm that perhaps the data sums of the information beforehand and the information afterwards are the same. I have to put my cards on the table. So I am not an IT professional in any way, shape or form. So in this particular instance, what I would be doing is saying to the IT guys, okay, how would we do this? How is the best way of demonstrating that this system is that all of the data has been recovered? And that's where I would be asking the silly question. So if they indicated that checksum would demonstrate it and that would be fine, I would be asking them, why is that the case? Please explain to me, so that I could then explain it to an auditor. Does that answer your question, Nitin?
Yes.
Perfect.
He says yes. Okay. There is another question from Polnar. How should legacy validated systems be handled in terms of data accessibility?
Another extremely good question. I think the legacy systems are a real problem, because obviously what you've got is a system that was built before these requirements, and certainly when we're looking at the newer requirements have come in. So I would be looking at that computer system, and I would be asking the questions around that criticality. What's it being used for? Could that information impact on patient safety, on data integrity? And if it's a really, really critical system, I would actually then be looking at how could I replace the system. So that would be we then need to change it moving forward. And then in the meantime, I would be looking at what controls could we put in place to ensure that we can meet the principles of Alcoa. So let's go with a historic system. Maybe the historic system has capability for 2 logons. There's a user logon and there's an administrator logon. So we can tell the difference between an administrator and a user. What I would be saying was, okay, that's not acceptable. So the computer system is not acceptable. If we have to use that computer system, there's no way we can get around it. I would then require procedural controls that say, okay, every time you log onto the system, every time you do a test, what you need to do is you need to record the information in the logbook as to who was doing it, when they were doing it, and how they were doing it. So you could then tie up the entries, but ultimately I'd be then looking at how we replace that system.
There is also another question from Mohammed Rashid. If the supplier of the system sells the system or equipment brackets to you as customized and updated the system without your knowledge, how regulations and existing laws protect the user?
This is a real problem. Historically, I worked in laboratories, and what you would have is sort of standalone, so things like HPLCs. So the HPLC had its own software. The software was a particular version, and what would happen on a regular basis, the vendor would come in, they would do some maintenance on the system, and the vendor would then change to upgrade the system. So they were saying, oh, it's okay, you know, this is the latest software, you're not running the software, so they would then update it. So if we discovered that happened, what we would then do is we would have to raise a deviation in the system, and then we would do an assessment as to what's changed, and we would consider the impact of the change. We then had to educate our vendors that they can't do that, and then we had to educate our users of the system to make sure they were there working with that vendor to make sure it didn't happen. And ultimately, what we would then do is we would put it in our quality agreement with that vendor. If it's a critical system, we would be saying to that vendor, you cannot change the software without our permission. So again, we can put those controls in place. Historically, a lot of when computer system validation first came into the fore, when computer systems became more complicated, that was very often an issue. Now what you typically find is the big manufacturers of the equipment know about it, and they built their systems to actually ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen. But that's how I would control it. So I would control it with sort of monitoring the vendor, and if the vendor carried on doing it, then I would start looking at potentially raising a complaint within their system and monitoring it within our quality system, to the point where if they did it on multiple occasions, I might consider doing full cause audits, etc., and just work out what's going on there.
Yes. Also, there is another question from Godwin Ngeno. Godwin, how are technical deviations and fixes documented during testing? Is there version control for configuration file scripts and documentation? Also, you can use the microphone to ask a question. You can raise your hand.
Again, another very good question. So when we're looking at, you've got 2 different levels of bug fixes potentially. You've got the bug fixes in the coding itself, and I can't pretend to know much about the actual coding process, but if I did an audit or an inspection of an organization that was actually writing the coding, I would be looking for their procedures for how they do bug fixes, how they do version control of their software, who signs off on the bug fixes. So if something went wrong during that coding, and I'm looking at a life cycle approach to the actual coding itself. So you start with, let's say, version 1, you then do some testing, you find issues, you correct those issues. So then you've got version 2, and I'm looking at some sort of documentation process that goes from the initial version to the version that perhaps is then finally released to the customer, whatever that version may be. So that's sort of the first set. The second set could be where it's not associated with the software itself. It's associated with the use of the software. So we've asked for a particular functionality, and the software doesn't deliver the functionality quite as we've indicated. So it's not so much a problem with the software code, it's perhaps the interpretation of the code. And then I would be looking at, okay, what's the consequence? Is it significant? If it's significant, we would need to go back and do some sort of change to the software, which then goes through the software design process and back again. If it's not significant, we might justify why we don't need it and why we can then carry on. So that's that sort of 2 levels. You've got your user requirement level at the top level, and then you've got the software errors at the second level. Hopefully that explains that.
Sure, it does. You can have one more question. Maybe someone to use the mic to ask a question. So, since we are past time, I could request you to make your last remarks, and then we can close it up. Yeah.
Just to say thank you very much for listening. I wish you the very best of luck if you're starting in the pharmaceutical industry. Having been in it for a while, it's a very exciting place to be, and I think it's definitely well worthwhile doing it. Thank you for listening. If there's any feedback, please do provide the feedback. It's always very useful, and trying to improve what we do and how we do it is very important from a CEPI and a personal point of view as well. And I will provide the slides to yourself, Dr. Clive, if that's okay. And then if you could distribute them, would that be acceptable?
Yeah, I'll be able to distribute them to the participants of this webinar.
Perfect. And if there's, as we said, if there's any questions or comments, I'm very happy to answer those as necessary.
Yes, thank you. We really appreciate for the insightful presentation and for handling the Q&A session. And thank you very much to everyone in this webinar. We would like to hear about your experiences and what else you could like us to discuss in upcoming forums. Before we close, kindly requesting that you take a few minutes to respond to the post-webinar survey posted in the chat. I've posted a link for the survey on the chat box. Have a nice evening and looking forward to more engagements with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.